Clint Eastwood sat back in his chair, the studio lights casting sharp shadows across his weathered face. The live broadcast had drawn millions, eager to see the legendary actor and director in action. Across from him sat the host, a polished figure in a crisp suit, his smug smile betraying the ambush he had planned. "So, Clint," the host began, leaning forward, "you've been in this industry for decades. You've seen political shifts, cultural revolutions. But don't you think supporting someone like Donald Trump tarnishes your legacy?" A hush fell over the audience. Eastwood didn't so much as blink. His eyes, as cold and unwavering as they'd been in his most famous roles, locked onto the host. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice low and measured. "You're asking if having an opinion ruins my legacy? I've spent my life telling stories, making films that stand the test of time. And now, because I don't follow the Hollywood script, you think it all disappears?" The host smirked, crossing his arms. "Well, many people would argue. Many people argue a lot of things," Eastwood interrupted. "But let me ask you something. Do you respect people who stand by their convictions, or do you only respect the ones who agree with you?" The host hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "It's not about that, Clint. It's about responsibility. Celebrities have influence, and when you support someone as divisive as Trump," Eastwood let out a slow chuckle. "You mean when I don't support the person you want me to?" He leaned forward slightly, his presence filling the room. "Responsibility isn't about following the crowd. I've lived through wars. I've seen politicians come and go, and I've watched Hollywood turn from storytelling to pushing agendas. Real responsibility is telling the truth as you see it, not bending to whatever narrative is the loudest." The audience murmured, some shifting in their seats. The host pushed on, determined to regain control. "But Trump's rhetoric," Eastwood held up a hand. "I don't worship politicians. Never have, never will. But I respect a man who doesn't pretend to be something he's not. You can disagree with his methods, sure, but don't act like every politician before him was some kind of saint. The difference is, he doesn't hide who he is. He fights, and people respect that." The host's smile wavered for the first time. "So you have no regrets about your public comments supporting him?" "Regret?" Eastwood shook his head, his expression hardening. "I regret the times I didn't speak my mind. The times I let people like you make me second-guess saying something honest. But this?" He gestured around, his tone unwavering. "This is nothing. I've faced tougher men than you, kid. I didn't back down then, and I sure as hell won't now." The host swallowed, his confidence slipping. The audience, once reserved, began to murmur in agreement. Some even clapped. Eastwood leaned in just a little closer. "You invited me here hoping to back me into a corner, thinking I'd hesitate, maybe even backpedal. But let me tell you something. Real men don't do that. Real men own their words. So if you want to talk politics, fine. But don't sit there and pretend you're holding me accountable. You just don't like my answer." The host forced a chuckle, clearly trying to regain control. "Well, Clint, you're definitely not afraid to speak your mind." "That's right," Eastwood said, standing up with the same quiet authority he had carried his whole career. "And that's the difference between us." With that, he turned and walked off the set, leaving the host scrambling for words. The internet exploded within minutes. Clips of the exchange spread like wildfire. Fans and critics alike dissected every word, but one thing was undeniable. Clint Eastwood had, once again, proven that in a world full of scripted narratives, a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous kind of guest. Back in the control room, producers scrambled to regain control of the broadcast. The host, now visibly flustered, forced a smile and turned to the camera. "Well, that was Clint Eastwood, ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying a nervous edge. "A man who certainly doesn't hold back." He glanced toward the offstage exit where Eastwood had disappeared, as if hoping he might return. "Let's take a quick break." The screen cut to commercial, but the damage had already been done. Within minutes, social media erupted. Clips of Eastwood's remarks spread like wildfire. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, everywhere, people were either praising him for standing his ground or criticizing him for refusing to play along with the Mainstream narrative. Clint Eastwood just dropped the mic on live TV. One tweet read, "Absolute legend." They tried to corner him and he walked right through it like a Clint Eastwood movie, said another. But not everyone was impressed. Critics on the other side were just as vocal. Typical Hollywood dinosaur. Clinging to the past, one post scoffed. Eastwood is out of touch. His movies are great, but his politics? No thanks, another argued. Regardless of where people stood, one thing was clear. Eastwood had created a moment no one would forget. Meanwhile, backstage, a production assistant hurried to catch up with Eastwood. "Mr. Eastwood, the network wants to know if you'd be willing to come back and clarify some of your comments," she said hesitantly. Eastwood gave her a long, measured look before shaking his head. "I said what I meant. If they didn't like it, that's their problem." He pushed open the exit door and stepped into the night, the cool air hitting his face. As he walked toward his waiting car, his phone buzzed. It was his longtime friend and fellow actor, an old-school Hollywood legend like himself. "Clint," the voice on the other end said, amusement in his tone. "Saw the interview. You really know how to ruffle some feathers." Eastwood smirked, unlocking his car. "I just call it like I see it, always have." The voice on the phone chuckled. "Well, you just set the internet on fire." Eastwood slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. "Good," he said simply. "Maybe it needed a little heat." As he drove off into the night, the host sat alone in the studio, staring at the screen where Eastwood's image had just been moments before. He knew this interview wouldn't be forgotten anytime soon. Whether people loved him or hated him, Clint Eastwood had once again proven that some legends don't fade. They just keep riding into the storm unshaken. As Clint Eastwood drove down the empty streets, his mind was as calm as ever. He had been in Hollywood long enough to know how the game was played. The host, the producers, the network, they all wanted a headline, a viral moment. Well, they got one. The difference was, Clint wasn't playing for their team. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was his publicist. He debated ignoring it, but figured he'd get it over with. "Clint," the voice came through, frantic. "The interview is everywhere. Some people are praising you, others are losing their minds," Clint finished, his voice steady. "Well, yeah," the publicist admitted. "The network wants a follow-up, maybe an op-ed or a statement clarifying your remarks." Clint smirked. "Clarify? I spoke English, didn't I?" The publicist sighed. "Look, I know you don't care about backlash, but Hollywood is different now. People don't just move on. They want an apology, or at least an explanation." Clint took a slow turn onto an open highway, the city lights fading in his rearview mirror. "Here's my explanation. I said what I meant, and I meant what I said. If that's a problem for some folks, that's on them." The publicist hesitated. "You know, the studio is worried about how this might affect future projects." Clint chuckled. "Let me tell you something. I've made movies for over 60 years. I've directed, produced, acted, and I've done it my way. If some studio doesn't want to work with me because I spoke my mind, then that's their loss. I don't beg for work." There was silence on the other end. The publicist knew better than to argue. "All right, Clint. I figured you'd say that. Just brace yourself. The media isn't going to let this go easily." Clint shrugged. "They never do." He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. As he drove, he could almost hear the voices on the news panels, the late-night talk shows, the bloggers dissecting every word he had said. But he wasn't losing any sleep over it. Somewhere in an office, the host of the show was likely rewatching the footage, wondering where it had all gone wrong. He had set a trap, but Clint had walked right through it unfazed. That was the thing about Eastwood. He wasn't an actor playing a tough guy. He was the real deal. The next morning, headlines dominated every major news outlet. Clint Eastwood sparks firestorm after live interview. Legendary actor stands his ground, refuses to apologize. Clint Eastwood versus Hollywood. Is this his final showdown? Commentators debated whether this was the moment that would finally cancel him. But Clint knew better. He had seen men much stronger than these critics try to take him down, and he was still standing. By noon, his phone rang again. This time, an unexpected caller. Clint, the deep voice on the other end said. Saw the interview, hell of a thing. Clint chuckled. Didn't think you watched TV. Oh, I don't, the man replied. But when the entire media loses its mind over one guy speaking the truth, I tend to pay attention. There was a brief pause. Then the voice continued. Why don't you stop by Mar-a-Lago sometime? I think we'd have a lot to talk about. Clint smirked, shaking his head. I bet we would. He hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, watching the world react to a storm he had walked right through. The difference between him and the rest? He didn't fear the storm. He was the storm. A week had passed since the interview, but the firestorm had only grown. Every major media outlet was running endless debates about Clint Eastwood's controversial remarks. Hollywood insiders whispered about whether this was the final straw, whether studios would start blacklisting him. But Clint? He was busy enjoying his morning coffee at a quiet cafe in Carmel, the coastal town he had long called home. The ocean breeze rolled in, carrying the scent of salt and pine. Unlike the talking heads on TV, the locals here didn't treat him like a political battleground. To them, he was just Clint, the guy who would chat about old westerns, local politics, and whether the fishing was good that week. A waitress approached his table, smiling nervously. Mr. Eastwood, I just want to say that interview. Wow. You really gave it to him. Clint smirked. Just said what needed to be said. Well, my dad's a huge fan, she continued, setting down his check. Says the world needs more men like you. Clint gave a small nod. Tell your dad I said thanks. As he left the cafe, he noticed a group of tourists sneaking photos from across the street. Some wore admiring smiles. Others seemed to be debating whether to approach. It wasn't the first time Clint had seen that look. People unsure whether to treat him like a hero or a villain. He shook his head. People used to respect a man who spoke his mind even if they didn't agree with him. But these days, they expected apologies, backtracking, excuses. They weren't going to get that from him. Back in Hollywood, the fallout was intensifying. A few actors had spoken out against him, calling him out of touch and problematic. Late-night hosts had turned him into their favorite punching fuss, but Clint wasn't alone. A few bold voices in the industry, directors, actors, even some younger stars who weren't afraid of the mob, had come to his defense. Eastwood is one of the last real men in Hollywood, one rising actor tweeted. You don't have to agree with him to respect his courage. Meanwhile, an unexpected development was taking shape. His films, old and new, had surged to the top of streaming platforms. People were revisiting his classics, from Dirty Harry to Gran Torino, looking for the same unfiltered truth they had just witnessed on live TV. And then came the phone call. It was from a producer, one of the few left in Hollywood, who still valued guts over groupthink. Clint, listen, the man said. You know how this town works. They're trying to make you toxic, but you and I both know that controversy sells. What do you say to one more movie? A real, gritty story. No corporate interference, no Hollywood nonsense. Just you, a camera, and the kind of filmmaking that made you a legend. Clint leaned back in his chair, considering. He had been thinking about stepping away, letting the next generation take over. But after that interview, after the reaction, he knew the world wasn't done with him yet. He let out a small chuckle. You got a script? There was a pause on the other end. Not yet. But if you say yes, I'll have one on your desk by tomorrow morning. Clint took a sip of his coffee, staring out at the ocean. All right, he said finally. Let's make a movie. And just like that, Clint Eastwood proved once again that no matter how hard they tried, they could never cancel a legend. Word of Clint Eastwood's next project spread like wildfire. While Hollywood elites whispered about whether he should even be working anymore, audiences had already made up their minds. They wanted more. Fans flooded social media with excitement. A new Clint Eastwood movie? Say no more, I'm there opening night. Others speculated on what the film could be about. A gritty western? A no-nonsense political thriller? Some even joked that Clint should play himself, taking on the entire media machine like a real-life Dirty Harry. Meanwhile, in Hollywood, studio executives were in panic mode. Some were debating whether to distance themselves from Eastwood, fearing backlash from the usual outrage mobs. But others saw the numbers. His films were surging in popularity, merchandise was selling, and every clip of his now famous interview had millions of views. One executive put it bluntly in a closed-door meeting. Like him or not, Eastwood sells. You try to shut him out, and the audience will just follow him somewhere else. As the script for his new film landed on his desk, Clint Eastwood sat in his home office, flipping through the pages. It was a story about an aging lawman, one, who had seen the world change around him, who had been written off by those in power, but who still had one last fight in him. He smirked. Sounds familiar, he muttered. That night he made a call. You got yourself a director? He asked. Not yet, the producer said, but we've got a few ideas. You interested in doing it yourself? Clint paused, tapping his fingers on the desk. He had sworn Cry Macho was going to be his last time directing, but this felt different. He looked out the window, past the California hills, into the setting sun. Yeah, he finally said. I'll do it. And just like that, Hollywood's last gunslinger was back in the saddle,